Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Can I ask you kindly to sit down? The session that adjourned on the 20th of January 2022 is reopened. The minutes and the texts adopted of the sittings of 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th of January are available. If there are no comments, I will deem these minutes to be approved. A few announcements from my end. Mr. Jérôme Rivière and Mr. Gilbert Collard are no longer members of the ID group and now sit with the non-attached members as from the 25th of January. The Renew Europe and ID groups have notified me of decisions relating to changes to appointments within committees and delegations, and those decisions will be set out in the minutes of today's sitting and shall take effect on the date of this announcement. And finally, the draft agenda as adopted by the Conference of Presidents on the 20th of January pursuant to Rule 157 has been distributed and is adopted. Now, as you know, today we are marking the International Holocaust Remembrance Day with a formal address by Ms. Margot Friedländer. Ms. Friedländer, I am honoured to welcome you to the European Parliament, and I thank you for being here today as witness of the Holocaust.
The visit was really hard.
The sight is really something that changes a person.
Nothing really prepares you for the real experience.
This whole visit is part of our common history.
You heard your steps walking in the snow. A lot of people walk in the same way, but they never return. So it's so hard to be part of the history in that place with that feelings.
Today, I finally managed to see in first person what happened, how it happened, and the people that were involved in what happened through pictures, names, dates, and personal objects.
If someone asks me what did you saw here, I will just tell them to come and see with their own eyes.
It's a must visit for everyone. It's an experience you have to make one in a lifetime. There are no words to describe this place.
I think the most shocking for me was seeing personal items like shoes, because that makes you think that behind every pair of shoes there was someone who maybe bought them for a special occasion to go dance or for a special night out with their family, and they never got the chance to do so again.
I never thought about their feelings. I never thought about that, and that's what I learned here, how they should felt.
It happened, and maybe it's going to happen again. These words went into my mind, and they stay there, and they will stay there for a very long time.
I think it can happen again. It can happen certainly more quickly than we might think.
A way to prevent it is through education, better knowledge.
We have to stay in the process of learning to spread the awareness.
Honourable members, dear Ms. Margot Friedländer, dear Colleagues, the horrors that took place in Auschwitz are unspeakable, but we must speak. This is a day of remembrance. Today, the 27th of January, marks our collective responsibility to remember the unspeakable atrocities committed towards all the victims of the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish people, the Romani people, the LGBTIQ communities, and many others that were stripped of their dignity because of their ethnicity, identity, race, behaviors, or because of their political or religious beliefs. The Nazi regime callously murdered 17 million men, women, and children, and inflicted unimaginable suffering and pain on millions more, while others' silence stood complicit. We remember those that perished and those that survived. Survivors burdened with unimaginable hardship. Survivors such as Zili Schmidt and Zoni Weiss, whom we are fortunate to have present with us online today. We remember those that, to paraphrase the title of Margot Friedländer's book, had to try to make a life in a world that tried to completely annihilate them and their families. How low humanity sank. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, we remember crimes committed against humanity in the past, but we also remember the importance to speak up in the present. United in diversity, we speak up against Holocaust deniers, against conspiracy myths, against disinformation, and against violence of every kind that target and single out members of our communities. Because despite decades of effort, we have not yet done enough to combat discrimination. In recent years, across Europe, anti-Semitic attacks are increasing, and our children are no exception to this violence. Only 2 days ago, a 12-year-old boy from Livorno in Tuscany was insulted, kicked, and spat on simply because he is Jewish. Fear still exists because anti-Semitism still exists, and because the fundamental right to be free from discrimination, irrespective of gender, race, ethnic origin, or sexual orientation, is threatened daily. We cannot allow complacency. We cannot allow impunity for acts of hatred that instill fear in members of our communities. Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides." And the European Parliament will always take a side. The side of respect, the side of human dignity, the side of equality. The European Parliament will never be silent, and today we lit up the European Parliament in honour of all the victims of the Holocaust. We must consciously act every day and in whatever we do to ensure that our communities are not marginalised by exclusion, hatred and indifference, and we must learn and we must educate. The 2005 United Nations resolution that designated the 27th January as the International Commemoration Day in memory of Holocaust victims also emphasises the importance of educating about Holocaust history, so that the darkest chapter of European history never, ever repeats itself. The United Nations resolution calls for actively preserving all Holocaust sites that served as Nazi death camps, concentration camps, forced labour camps and prisons. And these sites, as we've seen, offer history lessons in themselves. Sites such as the Alsace-Moselle Memorial in Schirmeck, just a few kilometers away from the European Parliament's official seat in Strasbourg, where through knowledge and education, current and future generations can learn about the hunger, thirst, disease, violence and death that were part of the everyday life of Holocaust victims, and they can never learn to ever forget. Today, we mark 77 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, a liberation from evil that signaled that there was still hope. The European project was built as a political manifestation of never again, a response to the horrors of the Third Reich with the ambition to integrate democratic countries together in the hope for a better future. It stemmed from the bold ideal that strength could be extracted from tragedy, that from the ashes of our common history we could forge a common destiny, a destiny where the values of peace, fairness, openness and cooperation could be instilled in us all, because this is our Europe. And today it is truly an honour for this European Parliament to welcome Holocaust survivor Margot Friedländer. Your lifelong commitment to combat discrimination through initiatives like the Margot Friedländer Award that supports young people in standing up against modern-day forms of anti-Semitism, racism and exclusion, and your lifelong dedication in sharing the message of your life is an inspiration to us all. And for this, we thank you. Forty years ago, Simone Veil held the same role that I hold today. The first president of a democratically elected European Parliament was herself a former inmate of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so this responsibility that we must carry as a house of democracy is not only institutional, but also deeply personal. And we will honour the legacy of the Holocaust victims by never forgetting, by never being complacent, and by always, always speaking up. So we will now listen to a guitar piece by Ferenc Schneidberger called Hallgatter, in memory of my people. This composition is a tune handed down by Sinti ancestors to the musician's grandmother, and it is dedicated to the Sinti and Roma people persecuted during the Holocaust. I will now give the floor to Ms. Margot Friedländer for her address. The floor is yours.
Sehr geehrte
Madam President of the European Parliament, Madam President of the European Commission, President of the European Council, distinguished members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to be able to speak to you today. A few days ago, on the 20th of January, an event at the house of the Wannsee Conference in Berlin recalled that 80 years ago, the National Socialist leadership had decided on the unimaginable 80 years ago, what they called the final solution, in other words, the murder of the European Jews. Today, throughout Europe, we are commemorating the liberation of the concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz on January the 27th, 1945. This remembrance is particularly important today. It wasn't only in Germany that people looked on and did nothing to protect their German neighbours. In many other countries, too, hardly anyone lifted a finger to save their Jewish neighbours from deportation. Denmark was a laudable exception, where the general population, with the full knowledge of the government, protected and saved their Jewish fellow citizens. But unfortunately, that was the exception. We only need to think of the Evian conference, where all the states except the Dominican Republic refused to accept Jewish refugees. Perhaps the Wannsee conference would never have happened if the Evian conference hadn't failed. I was the only one in my family to survive. My wonderfully gifted brother Ralph was taken from our Berlin apartment by the Gestapo in January 1943 and put on a transport to the east. He was 17.5 years old at the time. Neither my mother nor I were at home at the time. When Mother came home, the apartment was sealed. A neighbour then told her what had happened. My mother didn't wait for me. She herself turned herself into the Gestapo to accompany my brother. But she left a message for me with the neighbours. When I came home, they should tell me the following: I'm going with Ralph, wherever that might be. Margaret should try to make her life. That was the last I ever heard from my mother and brother. At the time, I was 21 years old, and at that moment, I was all alone in Berlin, without my mother or my brother, and no other family members. I managed to find good people who hid me. These people did something that could have cost them their lives. They shared their homes and their food with me. I had about 16 helpers and many different shelters where I was hidden for shorter or longer periods of time, and often in a very precarious situation, until 15 months later, in April 1944, I was arrested and deported to the camp Theresienstadt. It was mainly many old people who were deported to Theresienstadt. Married couples were separated, and the old people had to sleep in a small room in 2-story wooden frames with straw mattresses. There was nothing else there other than the wooden bed where you could hang up your few items on a nail. There were no toilets or washing facilities. They had to go outside to primitive latrines and wash at the well in the cold winter too. They got less to eat than the workers. They starved to death and died miserably just a short while after their arrival. At the beginning of February 1945, a transport of more than 200 men and 20 women arrived from Wulkau. These people, 1 year previously, had been dispatched from Theresienstadt to work on an Eichmann project to build alternative quarters for the Reich Security Main Office. Adolf Friedländer had come back to Theresienstadt on this transport. We met by chance in the corridor of the barracks, where we were both living on different floors. I didn't recognize him because he had his arm in a sling. His head and neck were also bandaged. When he got closer, he called me by my name, Margot, because we had known each other from Berlin, from the Jewish Cultural Association. We were so pleased to meet someone from before, and we then tried to meet secretly now and again. At the end of April 1945, I, together with others, was called to help with a planned transport. When a long train with cattle cars arrived, we didn't know what to expect. When the doors were pushed open, I experienced something that I would never forget. People who barely looked human fell or were pushed out of the overcrowded wagon. You could hardly tell the living from the dead. Their eyes were sunken. Only their noses stood out of their faces. Almost all of them wore a kind of striped pajama, prisoner's clothes, just rags hanging off their bodies. Instead of shoes, they wore wooden clogs. Many had only one on or none left on. Many had bruises on their legs, which were very swollen. Others were just skeletons. Something fell into my arms, a person so weak that I had to carry him. He was as light as a feather. Someone plucked my arm. "Margot, don't you recognize me?" But how could I recognize this figure who told me he was Arnold Kirchberg? They all came from Auschwitz. That was the first time I heard the name Auschwitz, because we had always ever only been told that the transports were going to the east. So Auschwitz was the east, and that's where these people came from. Shortly before the liberation of Auschwitz on the 27th of January, they were sent on a death march. The SS did everything possible to ensure that the survivors didn't fall into the hands of the Russians, so that the Allies wouldn't learn of the full extent of the extermination in the concentration camps. These people had been on the road for almost 3 months, first of all on foot in a long column. It was only men, even if at first glance they seemed sexless, like skeletons. Most of them had long since died, shot or starved to death or died of exhaustion. At some point, the last survivors had been picked up, crammed into cattle cars, and sent to Theresienstadt, which was one of the last camps that had not yet been liberated. They had no food. They were together with typhoid sufferers and in terrible dirt. Many didn't survive, but there were still a few hundred or so who fell towards us. At that moment, the East got a name. At that moment, we found out about the death camps, and at that moment, I realized that I would never see my mother and brother again. I no longer had any hope. I wanted to survive because I wanted to see my family again. What was the point of my survival now? There were many rumours circulating in the camp that the war would soon be over. Our mood was tense. We noticed first from the behaviour of the SS men that something had changed. They were running around, loading their belongings onto trucks. Their possessions that also included everything that they had stolen from us. We waited eagerly. At some point, the gate opened and the first trucks left the ghetto. We could hardly believe it. Were we soon going to be liberated? A few days later, it was May the 5th, Commander Rahm left the camp. An SS man stood at the gate and pulled in the swastika flag and took it with him. In vehicles that were still reasonably drivable, they sat tightly packed together and drove out of the camp in a column. From the windows in the barracks where I lived, I could see the road that led to Prague. That was actually strictly forbidden, but I still dared to look. And I saw an open jeep with a Red Cross flag stretched over the bonnet. A little later, this flag was flying at the commandant's office. A strange mood spread through the camp. Without us knowing what was happening, but no one was cheering and no one was happy. No one changed their daily routine. The SS have disappeared. Have we now been liberated? How did it feel to be liberated? We had waited so long for this moment, and now it was here. But we couldn't believe it. For 3 days we lived exactly as before, even though the Red Cross was there. The Red Army had not yet taken Theresienstadt. Everything held its breath. Then the Russians took over the commandant's office. The Soviet army had been marching along the road to Prague, just outside the camp, since the early hours. There were open trucks, cars fully loaded with soldiers. Tired soldiers were riding on tired horses, and now the gates were open. I was standing at the open gate for the first time. There were no guards anymore. No one could stop me from going out. Nevertheless, I simply stood there. Am I dreaming? Is it really true that I've survived? I carefully take a few steps out onto the road, but I don't want to leave. I simply want to see if it's true that I can go out without being shot. Next to me is Adolf Friedländer. We look at one another. We go through the liberation together on May the 8th, 1945. A moment that we will never forget. We were liberated. What was my mood? Was I happy? No, I don't think so. Because now I was about to find out what had happened to my beloved mother and brother. I don't really know exactly how I survived Theresienstadt. From the start, I experienced the ghetto as if through a veil. Every day I simply did what I had to do. Now I was liberated, but even that seemed unreal to me. We stood at the gate, unable to move, unable to do anything. After the Red Army had passed by, it became a little quieter. We waited to see what would happen next. Suddenly, everything was full of doctors and nurses who first tried to bring the typhoid fever under control. The lice-ridden straw mattresses were burned. Everything was sprayed with disinfectant. Medicines were brought in, and we were given soap and toothpaste so that we could finally wash and brush our teeth. Heavy trucks brought in crates and sacks with food for provisions in the kitchens, especially rice, so that the sick could get some light nourishment. Then something happened that we could hardly believe. People came to the camp. They were wearing on the back of their jackets large swastikas. Under the supervision of the Russians, they were now doing the dirty and heavy work that we had done so far. Now I realized that I was liberated. And my first thought was, yes, there is a God. Adolf and I sometimes went for a walk. We would sit on a bench by a river and talked about everything that moved us. One day in June, when we were sitting on our bench again, Adolf asked me, "Could you imagine a life with me?" Adolf wanted to marry me. But there was more to getting married, so I had always thought. I wasn't in love with Adolf. I was simply frozen. I needed time to become a person again, to be able to feel. Until now, feelings for me had only ever been associated with pain and memories. Adolf felt exactly the same. Maybe it was this pain that brought us closer together, more than being in love. We longed for a normal life. I said yes. Adolf gave me his father's wedding ring. Wedding rings were the only thing that wasn't taken away in Theresienstadt. Adolf had always worn it throughout the camp period and managed to save it. I would never take it off. Adolf wanted to get married as soon as possible. On the 26th of June 1945, we were married by Rabbi Neuhaus according to the Jewish rite. On the 30th of June, 4 days after our wedding, Adolf received a telegram from his sister Ilse from the USA. That gave him a new goal. I think it was the 10th of January 1945 when we left Theresienstadt. This time in cattle cars, but they were supposed to bring us to freedom. And then until July 1946, we were in Deggendorf in Bavaria in a DP, displaced persons camp. And we left Germany in a troop transport to America, where we arrived in New York on July the 28th, 1946. We were warmly welcomed by Adolf's sister and husband, a cousin and friends. Unfortunately, I no longer have time to write about the 64 years that I lived in New York from 1946 to 2010. Together with Adolf, ever since the 50s, we went on many travels, at least 30 trips to Europe. But we only once went to Germany for 3 days, to Munich. But we never went to Berlin. Despite various invitations, Adolf never wanted to go back to Germany, and certainly not to Berlin, the country of his mother's murderers. After 52 happy years of marriage, my husband died on December the 25th, 1997. Now I had to take my life back into my own hands. At the senior club of the Jewish Cultural Organization on the 92nd Street, I took writing courses where I began to write about my life. A documentary filmmaker heard about it and wanted to make a film with me. And I got an invitation from the Berlin Senate. So in 2003, I returned to Berlin for the first time. When I arrived in Berlin in June 2003, I went for a walk on the first day. On a street that I knew well, I stopped and said, "My Berlin." I'm so happy to have been born in such a beautiful city. In 2005, the film Don't Call It Heimweh came out, about my first trip home after 61 years in Berlin. There I made more and more new friends. These friends encouraged me to write about my life in my mother tongue. After decades, I wrote my memoirs in German. When I couldn't fall asleep, I would take my paper and pencil to bed, give free rein to my thoughts, and at those moments, the memories gave me the right words. In the spring of 2008, when my memoirs were published as a book under the title Try to Make Your Life, it was the beginning of my fourth life. I still lived in New York, commuting across the Atlantic, because I was receiving more and more invitations for readings from Germany. And at some point the moment had come. 2 years later, in 2010, I made it come true. At the age of 88, I came back to Berlin. Not only were there many friends there waiting for me, but I returned with a message that since that day I have been saying again and again to students at my readings. After living in America for 64 years, I've come back to talk to you, to reach out to you, to ask you to become the contemporary witnesses that we will no longer have for much longer. It's for you. Be people. People did it because they didn't recognize people as human beings. You can't love everyone, but everyone is due respect. There is no such thing as Christian, Jewish, or Muslim blood. There is only human blood. We are all the same. What happened, happened. We can no longer change it. But it must never, never happen again. I'm not only speaking for the 6 million Jews who were killed, but for all those who innocently were murdered by the Nazi regime. It is for you, for your children, for your descendants. That is my mission. I say it again. Be human. Ladies and gentlemen, you in this house represent millions of people on this continent whose democratically elected representatives you are. This means a great responsibility because even now we are all facing major challenges. It is with great concern that I see that the Holocaust, like the Nazi war of conquest and extermination, is increasingly being forgotten. We are the last survivors who can bear witness. Today, I see how the memory of what happened is politically abused. Sometimes it's even ridiculed and trampled underfoot. It is with disbelief that now, as a 100-year-old, I've had to see how symbols of our exclusion by the Nazis, the so-called Jewish Star of David, are shamelessly being used today by the new enemies of democracy on the streets to style themselves, right in the midst of a democracy, as victims. On a day like today, we must stand together so that the memory of the Holocaust remains alive and is not abused by anyone. Ladies and gentlemen, what has happened cannot change. I myself have had to experience how people have denied other people their humanity, first to marginalize them, to rob them, to burn their places of worship, and finally to murder them. This must never happen again. That is why we now must be vigilant and not look the other way as we did then. Hatred, racism and anti-Semitism must not be the last word in history. I have had to see with my very own eyes and experience where this leads. Today, on the 27th of January, we commemorate the millions and millions of innocent victims of the Nazis. Remembrance has a tremendous significance for us today. People, regardless of their skin color, religion or origin, have to be treated as human beings, and that is especially true today. Humanity, tolerance, and respect are more important than ever for peaceful coexistence. That is my wish on this important day of remembrance and commemoration for the world, for Europe, for all of us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much from the bottom of all our hearts. I will now give the floor to President Charles Michel for his address.
Madam President of the European Parliament, Madam President of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen, Margot Friedländer. It's not easy to be here before you and to take the floor after the power of such a testimony, after the power, the intimacy, the personal quality, the strength, the courage, and the lucidity that we've heard from you in this Parliament, which is the symbol of European democracy.
I'd like to begin by expressing my admiration and my gratitude to you, Madam Margot Friedländer. Admiration for your courage and commitment to bear witness as you do today. It commands our respect and it forces each citizen, each of us here today, to reflect on our own commitment to defend and improve the society and the world we live in. And allow me to express our gratitude, dear Margot Friedländer, for your words of wisdom. Your commitment has brought you to this Parliament today, the home of European democracy, to commemorate the Holocaust, when Europe's Jewish people were targeted for annihilation. Holocaust, Jews, home, democracy, Europe. Allow me to say a few words about some of the convictions that link these powerful and resonant words. The Holocaust was a European tragedy. Some people especially the younger generation, may see this event as remote and abstract, even mythical, a global commemoration of a unique, symbolic, and long-ago tragedy. Yet, it was on European soil that this unimaginable crime was perpetrated by Europeans against fellow Europeans, the result of unbridled hatred. And we Europeans are all heirs to this history, our history. And we are all the guardian of this memory, our memory. This gives Europe and Europeans, all of us here today, a special responsibility, the responsibility of guardians. The years pass, and this responsibility becomes all the more consequential because, unfortunately, we will not always be accompanied by survivors to bear witness. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is the home of European Jews, exactly like it is the home for all Europeans. Europe would not be what it is today without the contributions of the Jewish people over many centuries, contributing to our societies, to the sciences, economy, culture, and to the vibrancy of our European intellectual life. Europe is home for Jewish people. That's why today, with anti-Semitism resurgent in Europe, the idea that Jewish people are under attack just because they are Jews is absolutely unbearable. And that's why the strategy that the European Commission adopted last year to combat anti-Semitism and to secure a future for Jewish life in Europe is so vital. And this plan includes support for the creation of a network of young European ambassadors to promote the memory of the Shoah. Ladies and gentlemen, this Parliament is the house of European democracy. Anti-Semitism is a denial of democracy. When we defend Jewish life, when we promote Jewish life along with the life of all communities in Europe, when we fight discrimination, when we protect minorities, we defend European democracy. Defending European democracy means fighting anti-Semitism and all discrimination. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it was therefore no coincidence that those who planned, organized and perpetrated the genocide of the Jews were also those who, in 1933, burnt down the Reichstag, the German parliament. This building was symbolically restored some 60 years later and re-inhabited by the Bundestag when democracy was restored throughout reunified Germany. Combating anti-Semitism today means combating the hate speech and the conspiracy theories that have taken root and thrive, especially online. And this Parliament, the Forum for European Democratic Public Debate, is a place where this essential battle is being waged. Finally, I'd like to return to the Holocaust and to the crucial role that this event plays in shaping our European spirit, our European vision. The European Union is the strongest and most decisive response to the tragedy of the Second World War, a project of peace, of solidarity, of shared prosperity, a political project, forward-looking and founded on solid values. And it is this tragedy, the Holocaust, that has instilled us Europeans with a special sense of duty. The duty to defend and to promote respect for human dignity and freedom here, at home, and throughout the world. The duty to fight all that discriminates, all that weakens, and all that dispossesses or even excludes, as the Jews have been in our European history. This duty, this fight, is no different than the fight for democracy. They are one, they are the same. Dear friends, it's precisely because we have experienced the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust that today we work so intently for a Europe that's home to democracy. Democracy, this is our struggle. For democracy is never fully won, never won forever, but it is the worthiest of battles. It requires commitment from all of us, just like the tireless commitment shown by you, Margot Friedländer. Chère Madame Friedländer, nous voulons vous...
Dear Margot Friedländer, we want to say to you that we feel great admiration, gratitude for the poignant message, the powerful message that inspires powerful emotions, but also hope, strength. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Michel. I now invite President Ursula von der Leyen for her address.
President Metsola, President Michel, honorable members, liebe Frau Friedländer. I think it was hard for all of us to hold back our tears when we were listening to you, Margot Friedländer, a survivor, a witness of the greatest tragedy in European history. You told us about the images that got stuck in a young woman's mind and in her memory, the horror you witnessed. You told us of how hard it was to find your way back to life. And yes, this was the Nazis' plan, not just to exterminate millions of people based on ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation, but also to take humanity out of the people, to strip them of all dignity, all identity, all love for life. But your testimony, Margot Friedländer, and your energy at 100 years shows that dignity and identity are indestructible. I can't even imagine how hard it must be, liebe Frau Friedländer, to bring these memories back to the surface. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It is the greatest service, the greatest act of love for all of us and future generations, because you make us see, you make us free. Our freedom is built on the memory of the Holocaust. Because the very reason why our union was founded lies in two simple words. Never again. Nie wieder. My gratitude is even greater as a German, with Europe in her heart, because I feel the deep scar in my country's history and the indelible responsibility in our collective history. We want to keep our eyes wide open. We want to understand what happened and why, so it never happens again. And you, liebe Frau Friedländer, made us see and made us understand. There's one thing about your life that strikes me immensely. You spoke about it. Indeed, right after the war, you decided to leave Germany and Europe because the pain was too big and the past would never get past you. But then, 20 years ago, you decided to come back. Even if the memory was still alive, in fact, precisely because the memory had to remain alive, you came back so that history could never come back. And you explained your decisions, as we've just heard, with the words, "What happened can't be changed, but now it's up for you, the next generation." And yes, the next generation, they deserve to hear your story. They became your mission. And today I would like to tell you, your mission is our mission too. It is because of this mission that we have to come up with our thoughts and our work. And this is why we came with our first strategy to combat anti-Semitism and to foster Jewish life in Europe. We have listened to the warning that is coming from the people like you. Anti-Semitism has not disappeared. It still poisons our societies. A stunning 70% of European Jews don't feel safe when wearing a kippah or a Star of David. And throughout the pandemic, Jews have been the target of all sorts of conspiracy theories and hate speech. But this time, we won't close our eyes. Nie wieder, never again. Preserving the memory is the first step to avoid that history repeats itself. With the strategy, we are working so that all schools in Europe teach the history of the Shoah. We want to raise youth ambassadors of remembrance as the next generation who will keep the memory alive. And we will encourage students to learn about Europe's Jewish culture and tradition. For instance, just 10 days ago, Jewish people around the world planted trees to celebrate Tu B'Shvat, the year of trees. Our children should know about it because it's part of our European culture and history, and because it teaches us to take care of our planet and our future. Liebe Margot Friedländer, honorable members, today we have listened to the story of how life and dignity were taken away from millions right here in Europe. People were killed and humiliated, their names replaced by numbers on their forearm, and all of this just because of who they were. The union we want to build is a place where everyone can be whoever they want to be. A place where Jewish women like Simone Weil, a survivor of Holocaust, can race to become the president of this proud European Parliament. A place where everyone is entitled to the same rights and is treated with the same dignity. And this is what keeping the memory alive truly means. A continent that is finally united in its beautiful diversity. Vielen Dank. Thank you, liebe Margot Friedländer, for sharing your memory with us. Long live Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, President von der Leyen. I ask you now, dear colleagues, before closing the ceremony, to join me for a minute of silence. And to close, I now invite Philippe Graffin, violin, and Raphael Walfisch, cello, to close our ceremony with the Kaddish. Mr. Walfisch is the son of Anita Lasker-Walfisch, a surviving member of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, whom we had the honor to have here in the European Parliament on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. This session is adjourned and the sitting is closed.